These conversations were recorded in the summer of 2020. We wanted to put artists who'd met through Green Man back in touch as we all try and navigate the fallout of the COVID-19 global pandemic. The results were so good that we couldn't not share them with you too. We hope they give an insight into how artists think, their experiences at Green Man, and what they talk about behind closed doors.
Hello, I'm Gweni Llwyd. I'm an artist based in Cardiff. I'm originally from Dyffryn Nantlle in North Wales. I'm an artist who predominantly works with video, but I also work in installation and drawing. This year I was supposed to be presenting a new work at Green Man, but because the festival's postponed, that'll now be in 2021.
Hello, I'm Lexi Stevens and I'm an artist based in London. I make sculpture, installation, images, video and dance. I designed and set up the visual art programme at Green Man in 2016 after having worked in festivals for a long time alongside my artist practice. The programme has artist development at its heart and a dedicated residency that happens during the live days of the festival. It's currently the only programme of its kind in the UK.
I also took part in the residency last year, and the work I've been making since then has followed on from the experiences from that.
Fantastic. Do you want to go first?
Sure. This is a work called Grocupio that I made in 2017 for my degree show. So it was shown at Cardiff School of Art and Design and then the National Eisteddfod in 2018. And it followed experiences of touch and tactility based on an experience of mine of grazing my knuckles against a pebbled ash wall. So you can kind of see where I'm coming from. So this is a work called Anti-Beta that I made last year for an exhibition in Gallery and Art Space in Caernarfon in North Wales. And it was a work that stemmed from transcribing letters that my granddad wrote to his chapel in the 60s about the experience of flying. And I never met my granddad, so as a strange exercise, I transcribed them into kind of a primitive AI chatbot and had a conversation with him. And from that, I grouped together different digital artifacts and created videos that kind of followed sequences and rhythms put together in quite instinctive ways. So I'm really interested in these kind of internet rabbit holes where you'll just like click on hyperlinks and you just end up miles away from where you began. And I think that's kind of how I put a video together. The sound as well is quite an important part of my practice. I make quite a lot of weird, I don't want to say soundscapes, so they're kind of sound collages that I might make before I make a video and then gather imagery that relates to the sound, and vice versa. I've also worked in collaboration with quite a few individuals from different disciplines. So this is a piece called Crysau Gaernarfon that I made in collaboration with a poet called Margaret Tudur in 2018. It was commissioned by Cadw and shown in Caernarfon Castle in North Wales in the gift shop. And it combined archival material from the town archives, clips of the town, digital artefacts, and a text that myself and Margaret put together from interviews with people around the town. So the video kind of responded to the text, and the text kind of responded to the town. So it was kind of this big loop.
Cool.
Croeso I Gaernarfon. Ti'm yn gwybod beth sy'n digwydd rhwng lle. Mae'r tad, y mab, a'r ysbryd glân yn mynd am walk fwrdd gwylanod. Lle mae'r bobl mewn siwts yn apirio am sacinio. Lle mae'r basta bach yn cyrraedd o lôn mewn bod o dda, sgwario, ia. Trio, doch yn galad. Cwylydd, ia.
So it was a Welsh language work, and yeah, I think it really echoed the personality of the town. This is a work called Elephant Juice that I made in 2018 after working on the Wales and Venice Invigilator Plus programme, where I invigilated James Richards' show. And everybody who was part of the programme was invited to exhibit at G39 in Cardiff. I made a piece in response to a decrepit Venetian wall that I saw crumbling apart every day. And I could relate to this wall because, I don't know, for some reason my skin was drying up while I was in Venice. And I imagined this wall watching YouTube beauty tutorials and kind of played with these two ideas. So it's a wall giving you a beauty tutorial.
Today I am sharing my skincare routine, which has been a highly requested video. I haven't done one of these in the longest time. I honestly can't even remember the last time I've done a skincare routine. Yeah, it's been a while. And the reason I've postponed this for so long is because I don't have a set routine. I'm always changing up what I'm doing with my skincare. A lot of times I'm just lazy and I don't do anything with my skin. I'm always trying out new products, so it's always changing, so I don't have a set routine. So even what I'm going to show you today, it's not a set routine for me. It's just a lot of the products I've been using in the past few weeks.
This is a piece I made during lockdown for the digital version of the National Eisteddfod. It's called Dwylo Cynnas, which means warm hands, and I made it in response to a song that another artist had made, and it looks at the idea of collection. I'm really interested in YouTube sort of collections, playlists and compilation videos, and it's focusing on ASMR videos. So the colour palettes in my videos as well are often, they often relate to the focus of the video or the starting point of the video. So the colour palettes in this video were anti-anxiety colour palettes that supposedly relax you when you look at them for long periods of time. This is a piece called Dwylo Blewog, which means hairy hands in Welsh, and it's an idiom. It also means somebody who steals, which I felt was quite fitting as I often glean content from the internet. And it was a video looking at pink fur and early experiences of tactility, and it was a video shown within a tactile sculpture, and I was really interested in how a material can talk to another material and how the physical and digital can kind of have a conversation together. This is a piece called Validation Station that was shown last year at the V&A during a V&A Late, and it basically was kind of poking fun at Instagram, and it was a collection of comments that had been made on Instagram accounts of famous or successful artists, and it would play and respond to whatever was going on in the room at the time. And this is a work called Video Camera Test that I made for a live stream by an artist called Aled Simons during lockdown. And it's basically a collection of videos I found on the internet of people testing video cameras out, and they're kind of these weird moments that I don't understand why anyone would put them online. They're like 10 seconds long. You could easily keep them to yourself. But I found them they're kind of sad, but also kind of funny. Yeah.
Okay, I'm doing this test here. I don't know if this is working. I've got the computer on. I'm not actually recording to tape, okay? What I'm doing is I'm recording through the FireWire cable from the camera straight onto the computer.
And what you're seeing now is a video recorded with a new video camera that I got at Costco today.
As well as making my own artwork, I work as part of a collective called Rat Trap, and we produce music and art events around Cardiff. Earlier this year, we worked in collaboration with G39 in Cardiff, and we put on a series of artist blind dates. So we'd pair two artists up who had never met, made them meet in front of a live audience over a candlelit meal, and saw things unfold over 3 days where they either collaborated with each other or not. Thankfully, everybody ended up collaborating together. And we used this round stage where things would develop and live things would happen. We worked with artists such as Jenny Taylor, who's also part of the Green Man programme of artists.
Fantastic. These are some images which kind of just introduce my practice, kind of give a bit of an overview. I suppose it's useful to say at the beginning that my work generally has concerns to do with the body. So within that, I'm really interested in psychology, our interactions, and there's an idea of liveness that flows through the work. I often use slippery signs and symbols to make kind of poetic expressions and representations of things I experience in everyday life. And I'm really interested in what structures us in relation to others and the world, why we do what we do, and how that's embodied and expressed. These images are of a large room filling installation I did at an organisation called Artsway in the New Forest just after I graduated. The organisation doesn't exist anymore. It was one of the casualties of the Arts Council cuts a few years ago. But I spent 3 months in residence there and then made a solo show. And the show was very much about kind of deconstructing painting. So I'd just completed a painting degree and was starting to feel kind of frustrated with the flatness of the surface and wanted to have something you could kind of walk into. So these I saw as a kind of phase of expanded paintings. And it's where I began touching on kind of a psychological element and trying to articulate how objects might take on kind of a different connotation depending on the frame of mind you view them in, ending up with these kind of like maimed milk bottle casts. So also think about the everyday a lot in my work. This came as a development from that show. It's at Phoenix Arts Association in Brighton. And this space was amazing because you could take up the floor. So I could go and make this, the structure elsewhere had been hanging, and it had to be because the geometric floor structure was so dominant that nothing would really work on it. But I really wanted to make holes in the fabric of the space and kind of open up the container for the artwork to kind of enter into it as part of my kind of deconstruction of the flat plane. So this was called Confronting the Gays, and it sort of references some feminist literature around the time. I'd been reading about Julia Kristeva and Hélène Cixous and some of the other French linguistic philosophers in the 70s who were interested in the sort of things in between language, like enunciation and things like that belonging to potentially the feminine. It's really complicated, I won't get into it now, but it sits with lots of ideas about you know, something being active rather than passive, so a painting being active rather than passive and kind of getting off the wall and coming to be in your space. Both these shows were huge undertakings, and I did them on my own with largely the gallery tech and sometimes some volunteers. But I was really interested in working on this big scale. For me, it was really important that the visitor and their body were in there and they were moving around as you would maybe in a landscape. At the time I was living in rural Cornwall, and my everyday experience was very much to do with being a body in a landscape. So this is Wheel Francis Mine in Cornwall. It's basically a mining site, and it isn't as old as it looks. When the mines shut, when they all went bankrupt at the end of that industry, when that all collapsed, they used what was left over from the explosives to blow up the building, so the machinery was easier to sell on for scrap. So they're really like 100, 200 years old, not necessarily ancient ruins. This was a temporary work, and it was there for 3 days outside and had to be deinstalled each night. As part of the research and development, we were taken into an old mining shaft and saw the kind of holes that had been left by the material that was taken away. And I was really, really struck by things like the smell when you came out of the ground. You know, you've been in this enclosed underground environment, and then you came up out of that and suddenly you were kind of really smelling all the vegetation. And I really wanted to work with turf and natural materials in this. And the installation takes sort of some of its shapes from the ruined space, essentially. So these were all in a period when I was working very much with space and working out how the things I constructed could have a kind of visual dialogue with that space, and still coming very much from this kind of background of painting and kind of arranging and collaging these flat planes together. This is the work that I was commissioned to make for Village Green Festival, which is hosted by Metal in Southend, by an artist called John Kipps, who has also been helping me on Green Man since the beginning of the project. In fact, the first Arts Council application for the Green Man programme was written at Chalkwell House during a residency when I was designing and making this work in that classic way that things kind of come together. Essentially this work, it's a bit of a funny one, but it kind of, it talks to the interest that I have in sort of illusions and real and fake, which tends to sort of flow through my work, and I think is another sort of hangover from the painting basis. So it formed one of these 3 objects that sat in a row and looked very 3-dimensional until you got right up close to it, and then it failed kind of as an object, and was revealed that the artifice in it was revealed. This is another project where I worked with a space, this time an abandoned car park in South London called Wendover House. And this was with for an exhibition called Recreational Grounds. And this is much more recent work, and I was really interested in, again, this kind of idea of interactions. And this was a car park which was closed to cars on part of this estate, which has been in a process of demolition for over a decade. but there are still people living there, a really old established group of people living there, and then a lot of other transient people who are there on their way to other housing. And what tends to happen is people kind of walk through and they don't really talk to each other. And my internet connection is unstable. And so this work was very much about kind of taking these hand forms and gestures and sort of putting them on the floor in a way as if they'd kind of been strewn all over the floor as a kind of lost parts of interactions that never happened. And they actually come from a video which is about boredom, and I took the shapes and forms of my hands out of that and made them into these objects. So I've been working an awful lot with sort of space and outdoor spaces and putting work in sites that maybe weren't gallery spaces, which I think for me is one of the sort of driving things behind the programme at Green Man. Also kind of within this video series, there's a bit of an introduction as to Green Man and the programme and where it's come from. So I won't talk too much about that, but I think these are the things within my practice that have led me to be interested in the artists that we've worked with so far. I also work with dance, and this is a piece that I made with 3 dancers, Francesco Migliaccio, Robin Holder and Marta Pollack, and it's an improvised piece. They contributed to the making of that work. I directed it. It was made in terms of, it was made from a text that I'd written, and the text was, so this work had become more interesting to me again recently. It's about an experience of having lost your concept of your physical self as a result of separating from a partner. So a very long time ago, I had an interesting experience where after separating with a partner, I felt like they'd been my touch map for every day, and I didn't really know where I was physically, and I found myself kind of leaning on the wall and thinking, oh, okay, great, there's my arm. And looking back on it, I understand it now to have been, you know, a period of really acute anxiety that I was experiencing that was contributing to this feeling. But also, I was interested in kind of how we define ourselves by what comes into contact with us, and how that might translate into the kind of interrelational sort of scenario, which is something I've been working with more recently in my work. This was shown at Space Gallery in London. There were 3 live performances, and it was also shown as a film. I'm happy with the film piece overall. The action of putting it into a live space kind of, I think, changed the mood of the work in a way that was less fitting to what I was intending to do with it. But it was a really interesting experience to contrast the 2 things. This is a piece called Boredom Studies that was made for Scaffold Gallery in Manchester. Scaffold Gallery were an itinerant collective, and they were based at this point for this show at Paradise Works. The work is a film of me going through a period of boredom with some collage added in, which accentuates some of those sort of freeze frame moments. Down on the bottom left of the screen there, you can see that the hand is cut out, and that's one of the shapes that I've been using in some of the work that you've already seen. So this work was a sort of 8-minute loop. The laptop with the film is held in this very close-up kind of abstraction of my torso, which curves around and surrounds you. So it's kind of a play on kind of like the intimacy of computer screens and the experience that we have with one another through them, and the disconnection at the same time. So it had started out as an idea about a bit of a kind of confessional, and that element evolved out of the work eventually, but I think there are traces of that still in there. So I was getting quite interested in kind of, you know, this contrast between real and time-based, and what we think of as, you know, maybe the computer not real world. Not a very good way of saying it. But I think within my work I've used digital imagery a lot, and as I work with video more, that dialogue becomes more complex to deal with, I think. So this is an example of work where I've used photographic images. This work's called All These Tensile Gestures, all these things my voice will disguise. and it's very much about a sort of situation where you feel like you can't say whatever your truth is to the other person for whatever reason. But it was really the beginning of trying to articulate these sort of interrelational sort of realities and experiences in a physical way, using this kind of poetic approach of collaging things together and using these sort of slippery signs and symbols and tactile things out of the body. And these are some experimental things I made, sort of exploring those ideas further. This is called I Don't Want to Go to the Wedding, which I won't go into. I also kind of have been thinking about recently how to get digital images onto materials. I'm really interested in kind of tactility and kind of confusion between what things might be. People often see my work and say, is that soft or is that hard or can I touch it? And that's great, because I want somebody to respond with their physical senses, primarily kind of in the foreground. It's important for me in the expression of my work. Bit of an ode to Michael Dean there, who I totally love. This is a series of drawings I've been making more recently. So within my dance work, I've been working with specific phrases using a technique by Pina Bausch, who was a dance theatre maker who died in her 90s quite recently. And the way that she used to work was by creating a kind of phrase or sentence which embodied in quite an abstract way a kind of emotional state and kind of situation. And then she would ask her dancers to improvise something around that. And it could be anything. It could be a song, it could be a tiny gesture, it could be, it was very broad, but the rules were it couldn't be dance. It had to be just performance content, so theatre content. So I've been trying to work with these phrases in terms of making movement work and in terms of making drawings and sculptures that go with them. Dance and sculptural making and image making have always sat parallel in my practice, and more recently I've sort of tying them together more directly in this way. This is the phrase that I was working with on this was let me find it. Smash a plate of food in the bin, careful to contain the food and your emotions. And this one was trace the exact shape of everything in your pocket whilst listening to what they have to say. This one is tell somebody something they can't admit to themselves. And I made it after watching an interview where the interviewee was very keen to assert what she thought was her truth, and the interviewer very keenly wanted to push it in the other direction. And so this is an example of kind of how the dance and the imagery fits together. So this is one of the images I made of this woman who's holding her cup upside down, but refusing to acknowledge that there's anything unusual in that. And this is the movement phrase. is a little collaboration that Gweni and I made together during lockdown. So I had been doing a thing called 30 Works, 30 Days, which was run by 12 Collective. And one of my briefs was to collaborate with someone. So whilst we were in conversation about the postponement of Green Man, we decided we'd make this little work together, which we can talk about a bit later, but I'll just show it here.
Amazing. Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay. So I was thinking about the 30 works 30 days thing that you did, and also if anybody follows you on Instagram, they'll know that you do it's like photograph of the day, or is that what is there a title to that series?
So they're called I've started calling them Day 365. So and they came from the 12 Collective project is to make an artwork every day for 30 days in April. And last year I decided I would try and carry on making work every day because I was really, really busy working part-time and running the program at Green Man, and I was finding it really hard to find a time to put my practice in. And so I thought if I just did at least one thing a day which used my sort of visual way of thinking, my art brain, then I would kind of hold on to it. So I've tried to find something interesting every day to take a photograph of. I'm interested that you mentioned them actually, because I felt like it connect. I was really interested in seeing your work, the kind of the way that one thing leads on to another, and the way that an association between an image meets an image which is similar but slightly different, and it sort of evolves through this sort of time base in that way, which is something I found in the daily photos. That's something that's kind of happening.
Amazing. Yeah, I was definitely wondering how that process has fed back into your kind of wider work, but that makes a lot of sense, this kind of sequence or
and I was really interested in what you were talking about in terms of being interested in kind of rhythms and sequences in relation to that specific thing of one image leading to another, or one thing leading on to another thing, because I think one of the interesting things about working with images and working also in a kind of live medium is that I seem to really resist anything being fixed or stable. And I think that was sort of happening when I was making painting. Things were getting off the canvas and they were coming into real space. And I've never been able to make one single image. It's always 7 that relate to one another. So I've kind of just decided to go with that now. And realize that actually I'm interested in sequencing. So I'm interested in sequencing in a psychological way. So how our experiences kind of alter our kind of emotional DNA, I suppose, in a way, and we change and we have new patterns, and they kind of evolve from one another. And our relationships do that too. You know, maybe you have a bad relationship and that gives you a pattern that you do. Or maybe you have and then you have a different experience and your pattern changes again. So there is a connection for me between the way I understand humans to be structured and work, and my interest in finding things that relate visually. So I suppose it's a bit of a metaphor for that, or maybe just something I'm also interested in.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about that, and specifically in relation to music. And I was interested that you said that you don't necessarily see them as soundscapes, but musical collages. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that.
Yeah. So usually the sound work that I make is born out of this collecting. So maybe being on an online archive and being interested in a certain sound. So going back to the collaboration that we did in the beginning, there's this kind of bird song that I'd grabbed from an old video and then played with and kind of stretched out, cut and distorted. So I think that's where I see the collage element coming in. It's not as simple as making a soundscape, I don't think. I think it's more about the process of cutting and distorting, which makes, for me, it feels more like collage.
Do you see sound as a physical object almost?
Yes, I think I do. I think I work, I think especially because I'm working with sound on a digital platform. So, you know, the way you edit sound on a computer is very visual. So you almost can't escape that connection. You know, you're looking at the sound wave, or you're looking at a loop on like Logic Pro or something. It's always that kind of basic visual connection. But then also, when I listen back to the sound I make, I maybe picture something looping or something that might relate to that. So sometimes I'll make work and have the sound ready first, and then find or make a GIF, for example, that might work very well with the sound. And I don't know how it works very well. It's usually quite kind of, I don't know, intuitive almost, or like well, intuitive is the wrong word. I think, yeah, instinctive. It's very instinctive, I think.
I'm also really interested in your work in the I mean, I'm really interested in your work, like anyway, for many reasons. Like, you know, the emphasis on kind of touch and physicality in the body, and like that relationship between digital and physical, and some of the things that you said about, you know, work coming from thinking about your memory, and that memory being a very embodied one and a very physical one, and maybe from that period in childhood before we're concerned with much else other than kind of how our body meets spaces and how our self meets other people. It's sort of our world when we're children, and other things come in and kind of fill up the headspace as we get older. So like that whole realm, I think, is really really fascinated. But one of the things that came out while you were talking that I wasn't so aware of in your practice before was the way that you this idea of kind of language or text. And I was thinking, when you were talking about sound then, well, perhaps do you use sound as text in a way? And by text, I mean like as a basis for something to come out of. And I was interested when you were talking about the collaboration you did with a poet, was it?
Yeah.
And how, you know, did you use that text in the same way as you use your kind of the musical collages you use? Was it a similar way of working, or a completely different approach?
It was really similar. I've never thought of it in that way before, but yeah, now that you've said it, that makes, yeah, that connection is definitely there. I think as well, if I'm working with texts, it's sometimes it's harder because it's more of a concrete thing, and I feel like my video work becomes less interesting for me if it's very literal, or if it's very I don't want to say like obvious, but I'm trying to think of the right word. But I don't want it to be like something that illustrates a language. I don't know. So maybe that's where the difference is with sound, because sound is kind of this abstract thing anyway. And the connection does feel more kind of instinctive, and maybe more aligned with something like collage or something when you're making physically. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, and I think like it feels like you know, your work is very abstract, and I suppose that sort of grey area or that ambiguity that it kind of occupies allows this kind of rhythmic thing to happen with one, where one thing sort of leads to another and associations are kind of drawn, and it's a bit more of an open space. Whereas I suppose a very descriptive text, you know, I can see how that would be quite restrictive. Like, so for example, with the Pina Bausch phrases, one of the sort of rules of making them is that they're quite abstract. And some of the ones I've been set by other people have been, you know, as broad as, you know, a warm summer's day and try and sit down in a pair of tight leather trousers, you know, like, or like very open. But actually what they're getting at is a particular kind of, you know, there's a backstory to each of them that you can find or unpick or respond to, but there's just a bit more space within those.
Do you write as part of your practice as well? I mean, and I don't mean in like this, you're going to show the writing, but like, do you write in a kind of sketchbooky type of way, or like a, you know, there for you kind of ways?
Yeah, I mean, do I? I don't. I write kind of tiny mini scenarios or tiny metaphors, I think.
Yeah.
And this is where my kind of interest in kind of more poetic forms of writing comes from. And coming back from that research I did into like people like Helen Sissou and Julian Kristeva, who was sort of looking at more abstract forms of writing. Helen Sissou was a poet. It sort of stems back around that. I sort of just find it a bit more of an open arena. Like, so I write a lot. I write for myself. I write to manage my emotions and make myself feel better. I've always had a diary that I've kept, and I essay write as well, sometimes to understand things. But in my practice, it's more at the moment centered around making these phrases. So the work with the 3 dancers that was actually called Contents in Touch, I probably should have said that, which was about this touch map idea. I wrote a text from that, and it was a sort of poetic, prosy kind of text. And there were lots of sort of visual images within that for them to take and respond to and make with. So if I do write, it is in a way that sort of leaves the situation open for ideas to come out of it, rather than sort of, you know, I'm quite turned off by a very descriptive thing, which is very defined, because as you say, it feels like you're illustrating it.
I was thinking a lot about what you said about when you lived in Cornwall, about being a body in a landscape, and also about the work that you were having to deinstall and reinstall every day.
Yeah.
Did you reinstall it in the same way every day? I guess that would be kind of impossible anyway. Or were you reflecting on it after every day?
Roughly in the same place every day. I'd actually, for that work, my studio was just around the corner, and so I visited the site quite a few times, and I actually made a set box to work out where everything would be. But yeah, it is kind of tempting, and I do like this idea of kind of things evolving. And I would say one of the things that does happen in my work is that things get recycled. So things get put together in an installation, and then they come apart and they get made into another thing. And I was thinking about that a lot in terms of, I was reading a conversation with Robert Rauschenberg, and he was very specific in his collage works that he never used the same image twice. So there wasn't a language. He was very keen for there not to be a language behind his particular signs and symbols. Whereas for me, I think there is a bit more of a language, but still it's very loose, because those things potentially change their meaning and turn into other things, because I think meaning is so context specific.
Definitely. I'm thinking about you know, the use of turf and grass in your work, and how that stuck around, you know, like that idea of natural turf evolving into this kind of artificial thing.
Yeah. It's a bit weird, the turf thing, and you know, I was really hard hit by, as I was saying in that, showing the slides, the real strong smell of vegetation when I came up from being under the ground. And I used grass then, and it was just, there was something really odd about sculpting with a live material. And I was reading about Art Bearer at the time, and I was quite interested in kind of this idea of, you know, like artists making work with cabbages, or like actual real everyday objects being in the work. And I think, having been so frustrated with painting and this idea of illusion, I was really interested in something that you could just experience actually now with your body. You know, you could be present in the same time base as the artwork, which came out of the research about installation and kind of history of installation I've been doing. But it sort of continued. I mean, I like it. It's a nice colour. I like the texture of it. But other than that, it's more about, you know, I wanted a frame of reference that was really easily accessible. So everybody's seen grass and everybody's experienced it, you know, pretty much. And it doesn't have any particular agency, or, you know, grass can be something very wealthy people have. It can have something public spaces have. It can be something that not very wealthy people have. You know, there's not really much human socio-political stuff tied up with grass. It's so ubiquitous. It's absolutely everywhere. So it can't accidentally say anything that I don't want it to. That's been a frustration of mine through a lot of my work, is sort of trying to take objects from the everyday and stop them saying what they say. And I think my work is often about trying to collage together things which don't necessarily fit, and kind of rearrange them until they do, so they sort of say something or move on from one another. And that process of improvisation is really important in my work. And I feel like that live improvised flow continuum thing goes through everything, and the artworks are maybe just moments where that stopped and then it moves on and it becomes something else. So
it was interesting what you said about the video of the performance of the dancers. I've forgotten the title, I'm really sorry.
Content touch.
Yeah, so, and you said that you felt happy with the video, but there was sort of this shift between your relationship with the actual live performance.
Yeah, completely.
And going back to that thing you were saying about control and people bringing their own emotional state to an artwork, I was just interested in why you felt the video was more successful to you, even though it was not quite the same thing as a live thing.
Yeah, so I mean, there were various practical things, like the work was shown in a group show environment, and it was a very busy environment. So I think the setting in itself was slightly problematic. But I think it was something to do with what happened when the collaborators I was working with went into performance mode, essentially. I mean, not to say that I was unhappy with what anything that they did. It was all but it was the first time I'd shown something and filmed it and could sort of analyse the difference, I suppose. The day that we filmed it, everybody was really tired because it was a Sunday morning and everyone had been physically working really hard, and my three collaborators' bodies really hurt. So everything was very slow paced that day, which perfectly fitted this idea, another idea behind the work, which was about this sort of which was about the mourning process and sort of adjusting to a significant change or a loss, and kind of when maybe that process gets stuck and doesn't go forwards. An ex-partner of mine had lost his sister very suddenly, and I'd sort of observed this process that he was going through where he was trying to move forwards but it was faltering and it wasn't really, and I was sort of researching and trying to understand the process, you know, and felt like at that point I think I was still wanting a way to articulate some of that stuff that I'd looked at in a rhythmic kind of way. So this whole kind of environment of three people like stuck in a room, sometimes helping each other, sometimes not able to help each other, starting out on sequences and flows of movement that went somewhere and then just fell off the edge of a cliff and stopped, you know, or just didn't go anywhere, was really great as a film. But when you put it into a live situation, I think the energy changed, and I'm actually a bit anti-performances at private views, because I think the viewing situation isn't really right for it. You know, people want to drink and chat and catch up. They don't necessarily want to give their full attention to performance work. So partly setting, but partly just to do with that sort of energetic change. It became more of a performance. You know, there was more of a kind of audience-focused projection vibe happening, whereas in the film, it was all very closed in on one another and very private, and no awareness of anybody else outside of that, which was just for me felt like a different type of energy.
It's interesting that with the private views, I often find that with video work as well. Like I might go to a private view and that might be the only time I'm able to see that show, and I fully intend to watch the video work, but it's just, yeah, it's such a weird format to view anything time-based, really.
Yeah. So I'm interested, so I was interested in some of the things you were saying about kind of creating objects that are within the space that you show your videos in. So there were a couple of examples of ones where there was a film element, and then there was either an item of some kind, like sometimes a piece of furniture that had a particular colour and texture. And I was interested in kind of what the purpose of those is for you.
So they were kind of an experiment. There's something I've been thinking about a lot during lockdown, actually, because their function was kind of making up for the loss of tactility through showing something digitally. And it's something that's been on my mind loads while having Zoom calls and watching exhibitions online, and kind of this longing for something physical in a space as well as something digital. And they were made originally because it was like the video was having a conversation with the thing it was being shown in. And usually I suppose people are very reluctant to touch things in a gallery space, and you know, it doesn't happen a lot, and you know, that whole interactive thing can be really difficult and problematic, and it's really hard to encourage people to want to touch things. But I think even just being able to look at a texture, a physical texture, it does loads, doesn't it? I'm not sure how to articulate what it does, but just having it there as well as something digital can really change your work, I think.
So how do you, I mean, so now over the last few months, like a lot of our sort of way of sharing artwork has moved online, temporarily, hopefully for some, but maybe a bit more permanently for other groups of people, depending on how keen they are to get back in the real world, or you know, maybe it's opened things up for people who aren't really able to get into gallery spaces and do things for whatever reason. How do you feel about this kind of that big shift from the perspective of someone whose work is very much about, from how I understand it, very much about kind of a digital space and a physical space, or at least the physical body of the viewer kind of interacting as a sort of part of the work?
Yeah, I think it's such a like 50-50 answer, and I'm very on the fence about it. But I think at the beginning of lockdown, when everything was kind of starting to shift online, it felt kind of, I think it was like a grief thing, that it felt less interesting or something, or like I couldn't get stuck into it in the same way as maybe viewing something in a gallery space. But I think as time's gone on, as you say, it's, you know, it's torn down accessibility walls, for example, and being able to, you know, you can watch something by somebody based on the other side of the world and still get loads out of it. So I don't know. I think it's a great thing, but yeah, it's also something I'm kind of grieving. I don't know how to answer that question, really.
It's a really tricky one, I think. And I suppose kind of in terms of, I mean, it seemed to me that there was a real shift between the work that you'd made for the Eisteddfod, which was, it felt to me watching it like the focus on the physical and the body was so much clearer. Like almost like the fact that it was a single channel video on a screen that was going to be seen on a screen had meant that you'd had to sort of just be, it's almost like much more upfront about the content, which maybe some of that would have been done in terms of the physical, like you're kind of compensating for the person not being there in a way, making it work in a different way somehow.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I found that from that work as well. I'm making it, and it felt going back to what we were saying earlier about something being more clear cut or obvious, it kind of felt more like that. And I don't know if I'm like happy with the work.
Yeah.
But it has been interesting to kind of note that process changing or shifting. Yeah.
And are you as kind of, do you feel as intrigued and interested in making work digitally now, as you did before kind of that big shift?
I think recently I've been thinking a lot about sculptural work, and maybe going back to that, making objects and having work that kind of talks to each other physically and digitally. So making physical things that relate to my digital work and vice versa, which is something I'd really pulled away from maybe last year. But yeah, it seems more fitting now and more interesting to me now than it did. And I think, lockdown has a massive part to play in that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we might see, your work, I'm sort of aware that we might see a very different work from at Greenman 2021 than we might have done if it had happened this year.
Yeah, that might be true. Yeah, let's see what happens.
So before we finish, just tell us a little bit about that work. Obviously, we've kind of got halfway before we kind of went into this process, and the film that you're screening as part of the Green Man live screening is a bit of kind of bridge and part of your research around that work. So what are you thinking about at the moment in terms of kind of themes and focuses for that?
So after the residency, I did lots of research into microclimates and subterranean networks around the Black Mountains, and that was the starting point for that work, really. And it kind of bridged together physical and digital experiences, which is something I'm still really interested in and something that's definitely going to make the work I present next year, I think. So you were saying earlier about your process forming the basis of your curatorial interest and how you put together the programme of artists for Green Man. And I was wondering how working with the artists you work with might feed into your practice then, so back into your creative work, whether it does or doesn't. Just wondering what you thought of that.
Good question, and I suppose there's a little bit of a story behind that. So when I set up the programme in Green Man, I've been working in the events industry for about 10 years as a way to get together a chunk of money over the summer to pay for my studio, basically, because my work is not massively commercial, and so it's not necessarily reliably going to cover its costs kind of at the moment. So through that sort of period of time of like working at festivals, I'd found like a fantastic community of really creative people who maybe weren't so constrained by the kind of academic kind of world and the kind of very theory based kind of art education that a lot of people in the art world have been through. And there was definitely less loopholes involved in terms of getting things done. There was festivals somehow had some money and you could get a JCB and you could go and dig a massive hole and make a venue in a hole, or you could have a bonkers idea and made it happen. I was involved in Secret Garden Party, which was, out of which so many artistic projects and bands and venues and performance pieces came at this kind of like hotbed of crazy activity. And I'd also been I sort of felt like I'd found my family, but they didn't really get art because they hadn't been to many art galleries. And I thought it was a real shame that generally at festivals you see like world-class dance and world-class music and world-class poetry, but the art offer is often not that great. Decor at festivals is fantastic. The civic design of the temporary town is brilliant, but the actual art object or art encounters aren't necessarily there. So I really wanted to find a place where I could create a bit of an artistic community at a festival, so other artists could come away from that feeling like they'd had this amazing rejuvenating retreat, which is sort of the reality for people like musicians. They spend summer at festivals, they've made loads of contacts and they've got loads of gigs and they've done some work, whereas I'd spent 3 months away from the studio, just felt like I was going in the wrong direction. But torn between these two things. So that's kind of why I wanted to set up the programme. In terms of the sort of curatorial kind of vision of that, there was a remit in terms of the fact that it had to occupy the nighttime space of the festival because everything else was very full. And so we sort of founded it in artists working with light and digital media. And over the years that has evolved into, you know, sort of getting into researching artist practice where people are using kind of moving image and sort of spatialized forms and expanded forms of moving image to get some, and that process is very much led by kind of my interest in things, I guess, but also how we sort of position that within the festival environment. In terms of kind of like how people's practice influences my work, I kind of have felt, for me it's felt like I just feel so lucky to have been able to spend time as part of my job researching what artists do. I didn't do a master's, I couldn't afford it, I don't come from a particularly sort of wealthy background, and I just couldn't really justify in my head spending that money when I you know, was struggling to sort of make being an artist work anyway. So I felt like for me this has been the process of kind of putting together Green Man has been you know, a chance to really research into current practice, what artists I'm interested in doing, and I'm consistently kind of amazed by everybody that we work with. And it's been fantastic to sort of have an opportunity to kind of talk to people, be part of a kind of peer network with artists whose work I'm really interested in and who I really kind of admire. And I think it's really opened my eyes to what's possible in terms of you know, seeing how artists are approaching their work, and all of the artists that we've worked with really have been people who've worked in a kind of cross-disciplinary way. So my degree was very medium specific, and I felt it's been very difficult to try and marry up, you know, what is this dance part, what is this writing part, what is the image part, what's the sculpture part, what am I, like what rules, what set of rules am I trying to make a good artwork in relation to. So I've always been quite interested in artists who work across media and sort of marry that together somehow. So that's a really long answer.
No, that's great.
I guess so there is one thing I should say about Green Man and the sort of curatorial element is that I was really keen as an artist. The programme is really artist-led, I guess, because I'm an artist, and I suppose I see myself as an artist primarily, and a producer. You know, I work in arts management. I don't necessarily see myself as a curator in the traditional sense. You know, I don't have a degree in art history. I'm definitely somebody who helps other artists make their work when I'm not making my own work. And that was a phrase that my friend John Kipps coined that I've kind of started using as well, because we had a lot of conversations about kind of like, you know, what am I? Am I a producer? Sort of fits really well. Curator to the extent that, you know, I'm gathering together artists whose practice I think is really interesting and important into collections for people to see. But there is no kind of theme of Green Man, and I find as an artist I love to work in situations where I have the openness to make my work rather than my work being kind of slotted into a vision of somebody else's in a way. So I wanted to be very hands-off from a curatorial perspective. And I guess I've really got my eye on where installation is going and where digital media is going, and I'm interested in VR and AR. I'm interested in the gaming world and how that's coming into art. I'm interested in art outside the gallery context. I'm interested in kind of performance and liveness and sculpture and film and how that all fits together. But I'm interested in giving the artist the platform to take that somewhere, rather than me creating a kind of assessment of what I think that is and presenting it, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. Cool.
Yup.